So I love this quote that's up here. And it's from Why Jazz Matters, that reads in part: the jazz ensemble is democracy in action. It's participatory, inclusive, challenging, competitive, and collective. How true is that? And to tell us more about that and its significance for our DEI moment, please welcome Elaine Johnson, who is a member of our DEI committee. Elaine?
Okay, so thank you for those of you who are sticking around. It's going to take me just a minute to segue. I spent 20 years as an elementary teacher, and I taught 8 years in Iowa, and then I spent 11 years here in the Shawnee Mission District. So my head is with the panelists and thinking about what's going on there and what I wish was going. So jazz is entirely not that. And I'm finding that in my later years, jazz has kind of given me those soft moments that, you don't get while you're working and you're teaching. So all that jazz, what does that really mean? I'm just kind of curious, how many of you are jazz fans? Awesome. Okay. I'm probably preaching to the choir here then. So you might know that in 2011, UNESCO declared April 30th as National Jazz Day. So when we were looking for a DEI moment, I said, well, okay, we've got this. Across the globe now, there are going to be people and entities celebrating jazz on April 30th. That's going to be during our national draft thing here. So, but anyway, that's what's happening. When my husband and I moved here in 2005, we didn't know very much about jazz. And I remember looking for a car because my van couldn't make it up the ramps fast enough and people were honking at me. So, but I talked to somebody there at the sales lot and they said, you have to go downtown and go to the jazz brunch at Jardine's. You've been to Jardine's? Okay, so Jardine's is no longer there. 12th and Vine is not there. It's not a thing. It's gone. You can't find it because the highways were built and it separated those areas. So I've learned a little bit about jazz since that time. We just came off of celebrating women's history. And I'm going to touch on Mississippi because very important musician, Mary Lou Williams, was born in Mississippi. And she has a street named after her here in Kansas City. It's in the 12th and Vine area that no longer is. She spent a couple of years here. She learned to play sitting on her mother's lap. And she couldn't read music until she got about, 15 years into the business, and somebody told her how she could notate it. So she would play with one hand. She was composing with one hand, and she'd use her other hand to write down the music. So who learned from Mary Lou Williams? Charlie Parker. He would sit in listening to Mary Lou Williams. Count Basie. She moved on to New York. Some of the other musicians moved on to New York. So it created an environment that people, those who were involved in jazz, really had to fight against, because what they would play would get stolen and recorded, and people would make money off of it. So Count Basie and a few others in New York said, we have to create something that nobody else will play. Nobody else will know how to play. They can't play it. Charlie Parker figured out something one time. There are 12 semitones in a scale, in an octave. And he was, bouncing back and forth. He would practice 16 hours a day. And he discovered that when he was going all over the scale, he could venture off and play in any key. And that became the magic of how jazz works. I think it's fascinating. From somebody who really likes math, I think that's kind of fascinating. So what we do know about jazz is that the word came from something back in the 1800s, which meant spirit and vitality and energy, and they just started calling it jazz. We had Rachel, who's from Louisiana, and Congo Square in New Orleans is where this started. I'm going to talk way too long because I just have spent too much time digging around. But anyway, there were slaves coming from lots of different nations, and Louisiana gave slaves in the 1800s Sundays off. So they would gather in Congo Square and get these things figured out. And that became the marches for the Civil War, the marching bands. They took off from that. The music was played in churches. It was played in bars. And then it eventually worked its way up the Mississippi River. It ended up in St. Louis and in Chicago. Across the rails, we got it to Kansas City and in New York. Didn't get into the rural areas very much, and I discovered that's because there's a news desert. And people in rural Kansas, for example, don't get public radio very easily, and that's where that stuff is broadcast. So that's why it's in, in the urban areas, but it hasn't gotten out. I think it's kind of a twist of fate that the very same women's movement that became involved in women's suffrage was also part of prohibition. And the 18th Amendment was ratified in 1919. 19 months later, the 19th Amendment was ratified. But prohibition was in place by then. And the crazy thing about prohibition was that created the mob bosses. And then we started having all these speakeasies, and the jazz musicians had protection. They could go there. And so the jazz musicians who were in other places and like New Orleans would come here, and they would play their gigs, and then they would practice until the sun came up. And that's how they got, good. What I love about jazz, and I bet some of you do too, is that you go into these small venues and you can just sit and talk to people, randomly talk to people. And that, I think, is kind of the magic. You get to see these musicians looking at each other, that, communication bounces across, that call and response that actually came from Africa is kind of what plays out there. So it's between the musicians, it's between the bands and the audience, and there's this energy that goes on. And I have to tell you that I've had several political conversations, in these places, because it's so easy to just talk to somebody at your table. So I'm kind of a fan of jazz for that reason. So I think this is true, that jazz is truly democracy. It came from so many different places. It has spread to so many different places. It has so many different applications, jazz fusion and bebop and hip hop, and going into rock and roll. You can see, how it has its roots right there. And it's truly just a United States thing. It's an American product. So anyway, I've talked way longer than I'm supposed to. But jazz, April 30th is International Jazz Day. So go have some fun.